In this video, we will be looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 15. And this will be part one of two videos looking through what the Christian's relationship to the government should look like as we live in this world. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Now, if you ever heard that joke that people may say that no conversation topics are off limits besides religion and politics, that phrase, I can tell you, did not originate with Peter, as we see in this text, because he begins to think about the life of the believer in the first century and what that looks like for them to relate to the government, to the kingdoms that are existing around them. Now, let's just think for a little bit about what we've seen so far in Peter's letters. The people he described as elect exiles, they've been suffering at the hands of these human institutions, these governments. It hasn't been easy. And in fact, during this time, rumors are circulating throughout the Roman Empire that Christians are desiring to tear down the governments, that they're desiring to put up a fight and resist and all these things. And so people are starting to see Christians as a threat that need to be ended and not allowed to exist. And so that's some of the background that's going on here. And what does Peter say to that? Well, we might be surprised when he says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him. And we'll finish the rest of that here in a second. Now, we might be surprised, again, when Peter says be subject or submit to every human institution. Peter isn't going with the narrative of the day of Christians as being rebellious towards the government and trying to tear down these human institutions. No, he tells them that they should be submitting. Now, this is something that we could consider a general truth. We're going to see some instances where it's implied that this isn't always to be the case. Christians aren't necessarily always to submit to the government, but Peter wants to tell them, hey, this is the general truth. And in that, it tells us, I think, what our posture should be towards government and politics. We will see that this isn't something that we compartmentalize. No, we live as Christians first, and then that infiltrates and influences how we think politically. But our first posture shouldn't be towards hatred or distrust or even rebellion or seeing how I can thwart the government. No, Peter says, first of all, as a general truth, you should be subject. You should submit to every human institution, whether it's the emperor. You remember, they have some crazy and not very fun to follow emperors at this time in the Roman Empire, or to governors, those sent by him, sent by the emperor, those under the emperor. He's saying all those in rule, you're, as a general truth, the general posture of your heart should be to submit to them. And ultimately, the reason this is you're doing it for the Lord's sake. And we see down here a little bit later in verse 15, for this is the will of God. He finishes out verse 14 by saying, hey, this is what government should typically do, to punish those who are evil and to praise those who are good. At their best, this is what worldly governments will do. When they are acting rightly, they will punish those who are evil, and they will praise, they will reward, they will lift up those who are doing good. That should be the rule of government on this earth, and that's what we work towards and we want to see happen, and we applaud these things and pray that God would raise up leaders and nations who are fulfilling what we would consider just His common grace, His will, in the sense of punishing evil and praising those who are doing it, lifting up those who are good. But what Peter is trying to get across here is that the general posture of believers should be one of submitting to the government. Now, I think we can find here implications that won't always be the case, right? There will be times when it's not what the Lord would have a design of, it's not what His will is to submit. Times when the government is calling Christians to be unfaithful, calling Christians to go against God's law and God's rule for our life. Well, obviously then we're not going to submit to worldly leaders. We're not going to follow them. But even in the first century, when there's persecution going on, Peter can still say, hey, as a general truth, you need to be submitting be subject to these worldly institutions. And in verse 15, he helps close out and give one of the reasons why. Obviously, first, the reason why is this is the will of God. God has instituted authorities on this earth, obviously under him, as we read and think about in other places in Scripture, such as 1 Timothy 2 and Romans chapter 13. They're under him. But it is God's will that as he raised up these rulers, not necessarily meaning they will all be good or bad or all do his purposes or not, but he has given them some of his authority. As he has done so, that we as Christians would be submissive to them and have a posture of submissiveness or following the rules that they set forth, so long as they align with God's will. But the reason he says to close here in verse 10, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. What's going on, as we said in the beginning? Christians are being maligned and falsely accused of wanting to throw down these governments. Now, we know that the Roman Empire in the first century is not this bastion of goodness and fairness, but Peter is telling them we don't want the reputation of believers as being against these worldly governments. Why? Because our primary concern is the gospel. We want people to know Christ. We want people to hear about the Savior, Jesus. Our primary concern isn't with worldly governments and institutions. No, we have bigger fish to fry. That's what Peter is saying here. And so, negatively, as we follow the human governments, as we submit to rulers, we shouldn't be as believers picking fights with the government. Put in our day, our first instinct shouldn't be to hop onto Facebook and blast, whether it's a local leader or a senator, a president, whoever it might be. Whether you disagree with them or agree with them, our first instinct should not be as believers to, just roast these people and make it seem like they're the worst. No, that's not our primary concern, because Peter's point here is that when we do good, when we submit according to the Lord's will, then we put to silence these foolish people who might be saying, oh, Christians just want to do X or Christians just want to do Y. No, we show them that our primary concern is not the governments of the world. We're going to submit to them insofar as we can, because our primary concern is that people would come to Christ. And then finally, we also see, as we saw back in verse 12 in the previous video, that there's a positive reason that we want to do good, why we do these things. Because when we keep, in verse 12 said, when we keep our conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So as we do these things, as we accomplish the will of God, as we do good, as we live honorable lives, whether in respect to the government or other relationships as we see, there's a negative in the sense of, okay, people will be put to silence. They will see, okay, this isn't what Christians aren't the way we thought they were. But there's also this positive that we saw back in verse 12. They may glorify God. They may come to know Christ as a result of our life. So I know there's a lot of debate about this currently, and this is a hot topic. And therefore want to handle this with care. There's conversations even as we go through this pandemic of, what is the government's role and what can they tell us? What can they not tell us? What does it look like to submit faithfully as Christians, and when do they go too far? Firstly, I would just say that some helpful resources could be found at this website I found helpful called 9marks.org, the number 9marks.org. They have some good articles thinking through, okay, how do we submit to what the government has called us to in these regulations out of a love for neighbor? And then when does that maybe require that if the government's gone too far, it looks different to submit to the will of God than first to submit to these human institutions? And second, I would just say, let this passage, and the next video we'll look at, inform how we are involved politically as Christians. I don't think we're, as believers, I don't think we're to withdraw completely or think, oh, fine, I don't care, I'm just not going to do anything with it. But I do think we see here that we see a general posture that we're to have towards the government of submitting when we can, being subject to them. Because that's going to give us a greater witness, putting to silence these foolish thoughts. But also, don't live politically in a sense that people can't tell you're a believer. Don't live politically in a way that becomes the most important thing about you. No, Peter's point is here that all of this, all the way we live, all of how we interact with the government and think politically should ultimately be based on what the Lord's purposes are that He would desire us to do this, and the will of God. That we would do it not based on our own opinions or what we would like to be true or out of a posture of anger or frustration, but in order to, as you say, keep our witness by doing good, may we all just have a spirit of Christ-likeness, that the Spirit would lead us to glorify God and pursue Him, not pursuing whatever political winds of the day may be blowing about and blowing us every which way, but pursuing God. And by doing so, we would have a greater witness that moves far beyond what's important in this life politically, looking forward to that more people would come to Christ, knowing that is the most important thing we can hope and pray for.